This podcast contains explicit content and is intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Don't say we didn't warn you.
Hi, my name is Madison, and you are listening to Who's Knocking, a true crime podcast. So this week we are getting right into the Atlanta child murders, part 2. A little recap for you all. Last week we focused on the beginning of the child murders. This was 1979, 1980 in Atlanta. We talked about Atlanta and its rich civil rights history. And then we talked about the first number of boys and 2 girls to go missing and later be found dead. And at last we had spoken about the fact that they had been finding different fibers and hairs on some of the victims, and this information did get out to the media. And now we're going to talk about what happened because that information got out to the media. And I just have to say sorry again for my voice. I listened back to the last episode and I can't even listen to it because my voice I could feel how I was feeling and it was awful. I felt really, really sick. I tried very hard to hold off as much as I could to get my voice back to an acceptable situation, and this is the best I could do because I have to put out the episode tomorrow, so we're going with it. Did you notice my hat? No, I don't have merch, but I got this made because I just wanted to see what it would look like, and it's extremely cute. So if you're interested, please subscribe. It would be really great if people listening to this podcast would subscribe to it. That would be super helpful, totally free, and it would really go far in helping me create the show. Maybe one day I will do merch if there are enough people who listen. I don't know. And if you would so feel inclined, please subscribe to my newsletter that I put out weekly on Fridays. It's called Grim Weekly, and you can sign up for that at grimweekly.com. It's a true crime newsletter. It's pretty dope. It's short. It's just a little bit of true crime stuff to end your week. I love it. So I think we're just going to get right into it. So there are a few rivers in and around Atlanta. Atlanta does not sit on any sort of ocean or anything. It's inland. So there are some rivers. One of them is the South River, and it's about a half an hour drive southeast of downtown Atlanta, according to Google Maps. And then there is the Chattahoochee River, which appears to kind of go right through Atlanta, and it is also much longer. The Chattahoochee weaves through the city, and there's many bridges and pedestrian areas. The Chattahoochee River is 400 miles long and is mostly used for recreational purposes. The Chattahoochee was also very polluted back in the day, still is, but much more back when we're in the time that we're talking about. The river was and is full of sewage and runoffs from street parking lots, etc., yet people were still fishing in that river. Like we talked about last week, it was assumed that our unsub, and when I read Mindhunter and whatever, they call them the unsub. That's a very FBI terminology, but the perp, the unknown subject, is what unsub stands for, in case you never watched Criminal Minds in your life. But they learned that the unsub was following along with the media, and the forensic evidence that had been collected went out to the media. We now heard about this as the public, so the killer started switching his dump sites from abandoned lots and wooded areas to water. Now, the FBI saw this happen, and then that was their assumption, that because they were listening along with the media, that they adapted. So the first body to be found in the water was 13-year-old Curtis Walker. Curtis was found in the South River, and apparently Curtis's mother had ordered him to stay home that day because there was a killer on the loose targeting young black boys. But he slipped out while she was gone, and he was last seen at a local gun shop, apparently there looking for work. Not being one to run away from home, Curtis's mother was very immediately terrified when she realized that her son was gone, and so she called the police. Curtis's body was found by a firefighter in the South River 2 weeks later. It appeared that Curtis had died by asphyxiation, which is one of the very common, it's usually strangulation or asphyxiation that we're seeing as the main causes of deaths for the kids on this list. After Curtis, there was 13-year-old Timothy Hill. Timothy was found in the Chattahoochee only 1 day after the body of Curtis was found. This was another asphyxiation death. Then there was 21-year-old Eddie Duncan. Now, Eddie had some sort of intellectual disability, but this meant that he had a much younger mentality. He was very behind mentally. His death was attributed to drowning, but the police did say that they believed that foul play was involved. So definitely we could say that it's possible, and this is pure speculation, I'm just purely speculating, but it's very possible that he was asphyxiated or he was strangled, but that didn't actually kill him. Maybe he blacked out or something and then was pushed into the water and then drowned. I'm just saying that just because you died of drowning didn't mean that that's the intended purpose. It doesn't mean that the person who was trying to kill you started that way or even knew that you died by drowning. The perpetrator could have thought that somebody was strangled to death when really they had passed out and then they fell in the water. Thus, the drowning was actually what killed them. You know what I'm saying? I'm just adding that as a little sprinkle of speculation. You're welcome. So after Eddie Duncan, then we found Larry Rogers, who was 21 years old. And Larry was a small guy. All these guys seemed to be of a bit of a smaller stature. Eddie also had an intellectual disability, and he was not found in a river or in a body of water. He was found in an abandoned building. So Larry and Yusuf Bell were actually the only people or children or people on the list who were found indoors, and both of them were found in abandoned buildings. Then there was 28-year-old John Porter. So this is the oldest so far. John Porter was the oldest, and his case didn't originally make the list. And I can see why. He was 28 years old. He was 5'10", which makes him probably the tallest person on this list. And he was found dead in a vacant lot. He died of multiple stab wounds. And in at least one place, I read that he had been propped up on some steps. So I don't know if he was literally propped up or posed or anything, or if maybe he was stabbed on the steps and left there, but apparently he was on a staircase. John had had trouble with the law himself and had spent some time in a mental health facility. I think it was alleged that he had sexually assaulted a minor, and definitely had some troubles. So I see why he wouldn't have been on the list. I think it's very possible that this was a random murder and, one of the murders that just would have happened had there not been a child predator around. But because he was a youngish black male, he got put on the list. Then there was 15-year-old Jojo Bell. Now, Jojo had gone missing a month before he was found in the South River. Like most of the people found in the river, he was wearing only his underwear. This seemed to be the case. And the FBI surmised that it was because we know that they were being thrown in the river, or we assume that they were being thrown in the river to get rid of physical evidence, while getting rid of clothes would also help to get rid of forensic evidence. So that made sense. Jojo was last seen at the restaurant that he worked odd jobs at before he went missing. Next was 23-year-old Michael McIntosh. He was again on the older side, but had a smaller build. Michael was described as being mentally slow. So again, I think this is another intellectually disabled man, which is interesting because the ages are getting older, but their mental state is kind of remaining the same, if that makes sense. It appeared that Michael had been suffocated before he was thrown in the Chattahoochee River. Michael was in a pretty advanced state of decomposition and had to be identified with fingerprints and surgical scars. He had to be identified with fingerprints and surgical scars. Michael had not been reported missing, but his family had not seen him in 3 weeks, which I think speaks to, again, this is another person who has had run-ins with the law and issues with their family, not doing well socioeconomically, somebody who's kind of on the margins. Then there was 21-year-old Jimmy Payne. Jimmy had recently been released from prison where he was doing time for a burglary charge. Jimmy was another smaller guy standing at only 5'1", and Jimmy was found in the Chattahoochee River by a couple who were fishing. He was wearing nothing but his underwear, like most of the last few victims, and he was found to have died by asphyxiation. Then there was more. There was 17-year-old William Barrett. Now, William had been found strangled to death near an intersection of the Interstate 20, just outside of Atlanta. He was the first victim to be found with what appeared to be post-mortem puncture wounds, which that's all I read about it, but I wonder if that could have been animal bites and they just, weren't there yet forensically. Not sure. But he was also the first victim to be found almost immediately after his death. The medical examiners believed that he died only about 2 to 7 hours before he was found. So I think the task force was kind of hopeful. I don't want to say they were happy, but it's always better to, the fresher the crime scene, the better. The better you can analyze it. So that was exciting for them, though that's the wrong word, but you know what I mean. All of these victims were found between March and early May. So it was literally one after the other after the other. It was insane. Personally, like I kind of mentioned, I really don't feel like every single one of them fit the pattern. I think that a couple of them, especially the ones who were not found in the river, it's likely that they were maybe not victims of what we think is a serial killer, but they did make the list. One thing is certain, all of these guys from the very beginning, victim number 1, to the very end, victim number 28, 30, however we end up defining the list, even though their ages change and definitely, they get older and whatever near the end, it still remains that these were people who are marginalized by society. They were kind of on the edges. They were either, when they were kids, they were really poor kids. When they were adults, they were still poor and they still had problems. There was people who had criminal histories. This was still a vulnerable population. So the task force and the FBI were getting super restless. There were so many bodies showing up and at such a fast pace. And at this time, they had all the manpower they could muster from the Atlanta PD and from the FBI. There's always been criticism at the police and the authorities that this case, that the police really didn't give a shit at first. And it absolutely looked like it took way too long for them to start putting things together and recognizing a pattern. And some of that definitely was super political, and blame absolutely deserves to be put on the politicians who were probably putting pressure on the chief of police because they didn't want to incite any sort of race riots and whatever. The fault of all the people in power. And largely this is put on the fact that these victims were young, they were poor, they were Black. These boys were seen as troubled kids whose parents were seen as neglectful, and they were not really paying attention to their kids. That was the whole vibe of that, and I think that criticism is completely valid. It's clear that major people in authoritative roles really screwed the pooch, especially at the beginning. But I also think that it's very true that at this point, it was all hands on deck. There were over 100 FBI agents involved, and all possible resources were brought in to try to find this person. To this day, there is a basement full of hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of case files on this case detailing every child, every piece of evidence, and every witness statement. People really did want to see this case solved. And it was brutal. These were children showing up dead. Often their bodies were really far into decomposition. In the HBO documentary that I watched, the documentary series, it was graphic. They showed a lot of the dead bodies, and it's heartbreaking. So there's all these people that are on this task force or FBI agents or whatever, and they're seeing all of this, and it's hard to see. It's really, really sad. And I think that though it took way too long, they did give a shit. And maybe that's controversial to say because I think there's a lot of criticism thrown at the FBI and the police and whatever. And I'm not trying to take one side or the other. I think there's a lot of blame to be thrown at them. But I just want to make sure that I'm portraying the situation accurately, because I do think that at a later time, it was like the whole city was like, let's find this person or persons. So one of the hindrances that John Douglas really harped on in his book, and that you see portrayed in Mindhunter, is that because there were so many people and because there were so many different agencies and bureaucracies and branches of law enforcement, it made it very difficult for the team to be nimble and innovative, which is exactly kind of what like John Douglas and Roy Hazelwood were brought on to do for this case. John claims to have had a number of ideas and plans to lure this guy, out of the woodwork, but getting approval for his plans took way too long. And I remember this in season 2 of Mindhunter, although not super clearly. So one of his ideas was this. So the city had decided to throw a huge benefit concert in Atlanta to raise money for the Victims Fund. Apparently, the concert was started by Sammy Davis Jr. after he enlisted the help of Frank Sinatra. So there were big celebrities there. This was a huge concert. It was a huge deal, and everybody wanted to be at the concert, obviously. It sounded lit as fuck. So John and Roy figured that their unsub would probably be interested in attending this concert. So John Douglas said that he wanted to put out a job listing with criteria to lure the exact type of person that he and Roy had profiled. It would essentially be offering a free ticket to the concert. He figured that they could require applicants to have their own cars, something that they knew their guy would have. They'd say that a background or experience with law enforcement would be preferred, and then have them list their experience and look for people who maybe had worked security jobs or, worked in an ambulance or something in that realm. They knew that their guy was a police buff, or they assumed that was their guess, that this was like somebody who had maybe been ex-police, wanted to be a police officer, probably worked some sort of security job or something like that. They then could hold interviews and secretly tape them. And it would be easy to weed out everybody except the young black men which was also their profile. And then if they had a small enough list, they could then take these guys and check them against their evidence to see if anybody matched perfectly. Now, it is my understanding, based on what I've read about profilers and what I have learned is their job, that this is exactly what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to help law enforcement come up with the profiles and then come up with ways to use this profile to narrow down their searches. They were never able to follow through on this plan because the time that it took to make its way all the way up the chain of command and through all the different levels of bureaucracy, by the time it was up there, the concert was done. So that sucked. Then John had another idea, and he portrays it as his idea. I don't know if it was his idea or if it was like a collaboration. I don't know. This man loves to take credit for things. Just saying. And so his idea was to make a bunch of little crosses, maybe like a 1 foot tall white cross. And they would give them out to families of the victims and then erect them at some of the crime scenes and memorial sites, including having one really large one at a church where a lot of the victims had their funerals. He thought that if they surveilled a bunch of these areas that they had these crosses, that there'd be a good chance of nabbing their guy if he came to visit the scene, which he figured they would, and he thought that there was a very good chance that their unsub would maybe try to steal one of these crosses. This idea did get the go-ahead, but apparently, after it was okayed, a bunch of different branches of the FBI, including the Atlanta Field Office, the Quantico Carpentry Shop, and the FBI Exhibit Section in Washington, all began to fight over who was going to make these crosses. And by the time they figured their shit out, the task force had moved on entirely, and it was, way farther down the line that this idea didn't make sense anymore. Since neither of these plans worked out, it's really impossible to know if they would have worked or not, but this is an example of where having so many resources actually kind of hindered the process, which, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. It's very unfortunate. So we get to, I guess it was May, when all these bodies had shown up, and it's just like ga-gung, 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 body, body, body. It's insane. And everyone's getting frustrated and everybody wants to solve this case. So, and they're running out of resources. They're running out of money. They're running out of people. So at that point, one of the FBI guys had an idea that everyone kind of thought was ridiculous at first, but they did end up going with it. And he thought that they should start manning all the bridges that cross the Chattahoochee River at night. The theory was that whoever was dumping the bodies was probably not risking wading into the water himself and getting down in the weeds and risking getting stuck or seen, but that their perp was probably rolling onto one of the city's many bridges in the middle of the night, chucking the body over the railing and taking off. This seemed like a much more logical way to dump bodies. It would have been quick. It would have been easy to just, drive on, go to your trunk, chuck them down and be on your way. So they decided to go with that plan. This would be a costly plan. It would require a lot of people doing pretty much nothing, just sitting and manning bridges. They set up every officer, FBI agent, and police recruit that they had. And they had to start digging into their police recruits who were guys that were not officially police officers and weren't even allowed to carry a gun because they were in training, but they just needed bodies. They gave this operation 30 days. They would man every bridge from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. And there would be a car on either side of the bridge and one underneath. So that's 3 cars per bridge. And all they did was sit there hoping to catch somebody in the act. 29 days passed and nothing. But then, on day 30, something did. At about 2:30 a.m. on May 22nd, the last shift of this operation, a police academy recruit named Bob Campbell was in his car sitting under the bridge. He said that he saw a car drive across the bridge, stop in the middle, and then he heard a big splash. He shone his light on the water and saw ripples. So it looked like something had fallen into the water. He radioed the other guys, the other people on either side of the bridge, to pull over the car that was on the bridge, and they did so just as it had turned around to leave. This car was a white 1970s Chevy station wagon, and the driver was a short little fella with a face full of acne, glasses, and an afro. This was 23-year-old Wayne Williams. So when the police stopped Wayne, they said that he was calm. And this is the law enforcement story of what occurred that night. When they asked him why he thought they were stopping him, he said, and this is not a quote, it's something like, it's got something to do with those missing kids. Wayne denied throwing anything off the bridge. When asked what he was doing out at this hour of the night, he told them this story. So Wayne told them that he was a talent agent and that he had been hosting auditions. He had received a call from a woman named Cheryl Johnson, and he was supposed to go meet her at her house the next morning at 8 a.m. Some sources say 7 a.m. and some say 8, but it's early in the morning. He was out at this hour, at 2:30, to go check to see if the address that he had, that had been left in her message on the phone, was a real address. He believed Cheryl Johnson was not a real person, just somebody who was messing with him for some reason. This story obviously seemed super fishy and random and stupid, the type of story that somebody comes up with on the spot, but he stuck to it. They asked to search his vehicle, and Wayne said that he said no, but they went ahead anyway. In the car, the police said that they found some suede gloves with wool liners lying out on the, I think on the passenger seat. In the back of the car, the police claimed that there was a big nylon rope and a big, a piece of electrical wire. Wayne denies that the rope was ever there, and the police did not seize it, so its existence cannot be proven. Wayne says that the police picked up the electrical wire from the ground nearby and essentially planted it on him, kind of openly, and the police obviously deny that. At the end of the search, they didn't have enough to arrest him, so they let him go. As this was happening, they had helicopters and a search team looking in the water. There seemed to be conflicting stories as to what the water was like at that time. Some people say that it was very still, some say it was choppy, but definitely it was pitch black, it was the middle of the night, and unfortunately that search came up empty. But 2 days later, About 1.5 to 2 miles from the bridge, the body of Nathaniel Cater was discovered floating in the river. Nathaniel was 28 years old, but again on the smaller side with a slight build, and he was found to have been strangled, and his murder appeared to have been sexual in nature, as again he was found in only his underwear. Interestingly, Nathaniel Cater was the last victim to be found who fit the general description of those killed by the Atlanta child murderer. This is a very debated fact that this was the last murder. There are, of course, many other men and boys who have been found dead in Atlanta since. But I'm still unconvinced that anyone else who truly fits this pattern has been found. Please feel free to prove me wrong in the comments, but at this point I'm unconvinced. I probably have not heard everything that can be heard, so very open to the fact that I may be wrong. So, who is Wayne Williams? Let me tell you. Wayne Williams was born on May 27th, 1958, to parents Homer and Faye Williams. Now, Homer and Faye were older than the average parents, and apparently this was because they had a lot of trouble conceiving Wayne, who went on to be their only child. So, definitely they probably would have been younger parents had they been able to have a baby easily. Now, Homer and Faye were both school teachers. Later in life, Homer went on to pursue photography. They were very loving parents who absolutely doted on their only child. They were a middle-class family, and, Wayne grew up very differently than all the victims, right? That he had two parents. They made a decent living. I mean, in 1980, two parents who were both teachers. That was a great living. The Williamses lived in the Dixie Hills neighborhood of Atlanta, which was very close, or was the neighborhood that many of the victims lived in or frequented. I did read somewhere that they had grown up, they had started in that neighborhood, and some time between when they had started living there and until the end, that was a neighborhood that was a kind of a well-to-do neighborhood, and then at some point there was the kind of white flight and all the white people moved to the suburbs, and that neighborhood really took a turn for the worse, and the Williamses decided to stay there regardless. So they were kind of like one of the more well-to-do families living in that neighborhood. Wayne was a very interesting child. He was smart and did very well in school, and he was very entrepreneurial. He had big dreams, and he really wanted to make it big in the music, recording, entertainment industry. Wayne was really into technology, and he was very good at using it and creating it and making radio and recording technology and stuff like that. Wayne's parents were very supportive of all of his endeavors, and they funded many of his business ideas and helped him create actually his own working radio station out of their backyard. He, at a young age, had a radio station, which was very big at the time. Radio was everything in those days. So Wayne finished high school as an honor roll student, but he did not last long at Georgia State University. He dropped out after only 1 year and began working for a local radio station. He also worked on his radio station at the time, and he spent a lot of time promoting local music talent and experimenting with technology, radio technology, music technology in that realm. Wayne also worked as a photographer like his dad, but he would sell photos of car accidents and fires and crime scene photos to local news stations. Wayne had a police scanner in one of his family's multiple cars that helped him get to crime scenes quickly. But Wayne's real passion remained in the entertainment business. The photography thing was really just a side hustle, way to make money. He had a dream of creating a musical group like the Jackson 5, although his group would be called Gemini, which would be named after his astrological sign. Wayne was often scouting for talent among Atlanta's young Black population. He passed out flyers looking for young kids to come audition for him, and he was determined to find talent and would also visit local schools and ask staff there to give his flyers out to the kids. Wayne was an odd guy. He did not have a lot of friends. There are a lot of discrepancies on how people describe Wayne. There are many who say that he was a really nice guy, very gentle, very non-threatening. But there are many other people who describe him as kind of a sneaky, pathological liar and a bullshitter, and somebody who couldn't be trusted. He would often try to make himself seem a lot more important and influential than he actually was, which I think if you're somebody who's entrepreneurial, like, you kind of need to do that. That's like called being a hustler. But definitely he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way as well. And I think a lot of these conflicting stories, like, it could all be true at the same time, and it's very easy to behave differently around different people. And, like, you know, I'm sure there's some people in my life who think I'm a piece of shit, and some people who think I'm great. And that's just you to act differently around different people. Wayne never had any sort of relationships with women, and many assumed that he was gay, which was not a very acceptable thing at the time, but it was also never proven. No man has ever really come out of the woodwork to say that he engaged in any sort of sexual relationship with Wayne, nor has any woman. Apparently there was a woman who at the trial later said that she had sex with Wayne, but it seemed sketchy. And there were people who saw Wayne, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, like engaging in what looked like homosexual relations. But again, this is all kind of hearsay. Nobody like saw Wayne having sex with a man, I'll say that. Wayne was also known to impersonate authority figures. And in 1976, he was arrested for impersonating a police officer. Although he was never convicted of this crime, but it was apparently a thing that Wayne did. A neighbor who said that they had known the Williamses for more than 20 years told FBI agents that neighborhood kids thought Wayne was a policeman because he drove around a detective-looking car, he carried a badge, and he gave orders to the kids. Quote, many of them thought he started acting crazy 2-3 years ago. He would approach kids in an official-looking vehicle, telling them to get off the street or he would lock them up, end quote. So I'm seeing a lot of things here in this description of Wayne that really match up closely with the profile made by John Douglas and Roy Hazelwood. Their profile states that the killer would be between 25 and 29. At the time of the incident on the bridge, Wayne was actually only 23 years old. He was still living with his parents, and he fit the profile almost perfectly. So he instantly became suspect number 1. After the bridge incident, and after the police found Nathaniel Cater's body and decided to attribute his death to the Atlanta child murderer, authorities asked Wayne Williams to come to the station and have a chat with them. They interrogated Wayne, and he did not crack. He admitted to nothing, and he maintained his innocence. He did not ask for a lawyer, and he was, for the most part, generally cooperative. He stuck to his story about Cheryl Johnson, which nobody was buying. So Wayne's story of that evening went like this. That afternoon, Wayne got a call from a woman named Cheryl Johnson who wanted to audition for whatever singing thing that Wayne was currently holding auditions for. It was Wayne's mother who had taken the call and wrote down Cheryl's information, her phone number and address, and said that she would meet Wayne at her place the next morning at 8 a.m., although some places say 7 a.m., 7 or 8 a.m. Then later that night, sometime after midnight, Wayne went to the Sans Souci, it's French, Sans Souci lounge to meet the manager and pick up a tape recorder. This was a nightclub. The manager was unavailable, so Wayne never saw him. After that, Wayne drove around looking for the Spanish Trace Apartments, which is where Cheryl alleged that she lived. When he could not find the address, he stopped at a liquor store. He called Cheryl, but the number was busy. Later on, he tried her again. This time the phone rang with no answer. Then Wayne drove to the Jackson Parkway Bridge and went to a Starvin' Marvin restaurant to call Cheryl for a third time. This time someone did pick up, but said that it was the wrong number. That is when he decided that Cheryl Johnson was just a prankster. The police and the FBI looked into the story. They found there to be no Cheryl Johnson and no Spanish Trace Apartments. They did not exist. I think there might have actually been Spanish an apartment complex called Spanish Trace Apartments, but it was not at the address given. Wayne said then, and still says now, it was probably somebody just pranking him. But interestingly, over the years, his story about Cheryl and her phone call has flip-flopped a little bit. He said that both he was the one to receive the initial call from her, and he took down the information. And then he has also at some point said that his mother was the one who took down the information. In the Atlanta Monster podcast, this piece of information is a source of contention between Payne Lindsay, the host of the podcast, and Wayne Williams, who he interviews extensively in that podcast, because Wayne tells Payne both conflicting stories at different times. At one point, he says that he probably called the wrong number because when he recorded the number in his own writing, he made one of the numbers look like another number, and so that's why it was the wrong number, which is kind of doesn't make sense if he thinks that she's like a prankster, because then it's just him taking the number down wrong. But then on another occasion in the podcast, he told Payne that his mother was the one who had taken down the message. So when he was confronted with that, he's like, oh, well, my mother took it down, and then I took it down in another notebook or whatever. So he then alleges that it was his mother who took it down on a note. I guess, people back in the day when we had home phones, we used to have like a notepad next to the phone so that they could take messages for other people. So I guess he's alleging later that it was his mom who took the note down and then gave it to him, and then for whatever reason he then transcribed that himself onto another piece of paper, a notebook that he carried around, and that's how it all kind of got lost in translation. But also she was a prankster. And like, what a weird prank. But I mean, to be honest, back in the day, me and my friends used to prank phone call people because we were losers and had nothing else to do, and we said some random weird shit. So like, that's not the most unbelievable thing. It's just like, in this situation, it sounds fishy AF. So after or during this interrogation, Wayne agreed to take a polygraph test, and there's again conflicting stories on this, but for the most part, it looks like the results were inconclusive, and then he took 2 more polygraph tests, and those tests both indicated that he was being deceptive. I've seen some places say that it was all inconclusive. I think given that they are polygraph tests, the results are all inconclusive because polygraph tests are not the best indicator of much of anything, but he did do them, and he did not pass. After his police interrogation and the polygraph test, they did have to let him go. They did not have anything solid on Wayne. And everyone thought they did have their guy, but they just didn't have a case. So sometime after the bridge incident and the interrogation, it was confirmed that the Williams family did a huge cleanup of their home and cars, of which they had multiple cars. They were seen scrubbing down their entire home, their windows, the carpets, everything. And maybe this is normal behavior. Maybe it's something that they would have done anyway. Just a big old, deep spring cleaning. It was the spring. But multiple neighbors did report that their behavior seemed odd and out of character, and that the Williams were unusually curt with everybody at the time. Now, they were obviously under a lot of stress, knowing that their son was a suspect in the biggest serial killer case in their time and in their city. So like, that's not crazy, but just saying, that's what was said. Homer has also admitted that at this time he did a big clear out of what he says were all old photos and negatives from his photography business, and he had a huge burn sesh in his backyard. So he just burned a bunch of shit. Neighbors were super weirded out by this because they'd never seen him do anything like this before. They, smelled, like they saw smoke and it smelled weird. It wasn't like someone was cooking food. So a lot of them went to like check it out, and they were definitely weirded out by the fact that he was just burning a bunch of shit. He maintains that this was pure coincidence and it was all work-related materials, but unfortunately there's no way to ever confirm that. Now, the police were obviously watching Wayne very closely, And when they saw all of the cleaning and all of the burning and everything that the family was doing, they really hunkered down and got themselves a search warrant for the home. And I think part of the search warrant was granted on the fact that they were clearly cleaning stuff out and potentially getting rid of all the forensic evidence that they needed. And all this cleaning and burning really did put the police and the FBI at a huge disadvantage in terms of forensics. Because as we know, it's like carpet fibers and hairs that they found, which would be traced, you'd want to trace that back to this person's environment, which is their home. So that's very unfortunate. While in the home, the police task force and FBI did not find much after all of the cleaning, but they did take fiber samples from multiple carpets and bedding, and they took some hairs from the family German Shepherd. Oh yeah, I didn't mention he had a German Shepherd, just like the profile said he would. We must remember that this case took place in 1981. This was just before any real DNA testing was available. There was a bit of hair analysis available, maybe fingerprints, but most forensic analysis only really got good in the 1990s and onward. And I am somebody who subscribes to the idea that a lot of forensic evidence now is still not great, and there's a lot of junk science out there. So next episode, when we get into all the forensics, we'll take this with our usual grain of salt, and I'll tell you how reliable we think it is. But anyway, that's what they were in the house to find. At this time also, there was almost no CCTV, which really would have come in clutch here. Wayne had a lot of stories for the police concerning his alibis during the different murders, none of which could really be corroborated. But if we were living in the time that we are now, this would be very simple to check. Was he at this place at this time? Because there's cameras everywhere now. So the day that the task force searched Wayne Williams' home, he decided to throw a press conference out of his parents' living room. This was a very unorthodox thing to do for a serial killer suspect, or any suspect, really. This has never really happened before, and everyone was super weirded out by it. Wayne made the press agree to not show his face on camera or release his name, and they agreed to this. Wayne began the press conference by handing out copies of his resumes to journalists, which was bizarre. His resume had all his radio stuff on it. It had a bunch of blatant lies. I don't remember what exactly they were, but it was he really puffed himself up and made him seem a lot more important. This, I think, whole press conference, many people think that this was an example of his narcissism on display. I'll say I agree with that. He was very relaxed at this press conference. He was confident in front of the camera. He was in his own space. He did make a comment that would later come back to bite him hard in the ass, which was this, quote, "Some of these kids in places they don't have no business being at certain times of the day and night. Some of them don't have no kind of home supervision, and they're just running around the streets wild. And I'm saying when you're doing that, that's not giving anyone license to kill, but you're opening yourself up for all these kinds of things," end quote. So if that's not victim blaming, I don't know what is. But Wayne claimed that the task force were out there to get him and that they had been targeting him and wanted to pin this on him. Wayne ended the press conference by asking for an apology from the FBI. So quite bold. I've tried very hard to see or think of how an innocent person would concoct of this type of situation, or why they would, and I just can't. To me, this is weird. It does show him being quite narcissistic, genuinely thinking that he can go out there and say these things and people will be like, yeah, totally right, man. I think if anything, this whole display really hurt him. I don't know. You tell me how this makes him look innocent, because I can't. I at every instance I try to think look, either he's coming off as being a huge asshole if he's guilty, or he's an innocent person and he's just trying to do his best to make his case. in this instance, it's like, I don't know. I can't see it both ways. It's hard. But you never know. Maybe he was just a weird guy. People have their quirks, so it's really hard to judge somebody that you don't really know because you don't have a good baseline for what they are like normally. You know what I mean? And it did sound like he was a really weird, kind of arrogant guy at his normal base level. So who knows? After the press conference, his name and address got leaked in the media because they all agreed not to give out his name when putting out pieces on the press conference, but that didn't extend to after. So, that didn't really work out well for him. And this resulted in a constant barrage of reporters basically camping out in front of the Williams' home. It was a complete circus. Reporters followed Wayne everywhere, as did the task force. They were very confident in Wayne being their guy, and they were still waiting on evidence to come in. So things got very aggressive at the Williams house, and the threat of physical confrontation between Wayne and the reporters or Wayne and the victims' family members was beginning to be a big concern for the task force. And this standoff outside of the Williams home went on for 17 days. During those 17 days, the task force guys attached a tracking device to Wayne's car to keep track of him. He often took long, aimless drives around town at night, and they were really scared that he was either going to kill another victim during one of these late night drives or take off. The task force did have enough to arrest Wayne, but it wasn't as solid as they wanted. They didn't have enough that they were sure of themselves, so they tried to wait it out for as long as possible. But it did get to the point that they were worried for public safety. There were a couple times where Wayne led them on these big chases, and he would stop in front of the mayor's house or the chief of police, and it was getting out of hand. That's when they decided that enough was enough, and they finally arrested Wayne Williams for the murder of Nathaniel Cater. And I think that's where I'm going to stop for today's episode, for part 2. Next episode, we will get into what happened after his arrest, the trial, all of the forensic evidence and other evidence. The trial is super interesting. That's where things get super controversial. And then after that, we'll kind of get into, the big debate on this is whether or not people think Wayne is responsible for the bulk of or all of the murders, and that is highly debated. And there are lots of other theories that we'll talk about as well. So, yeah, that's where we are. I'm happy to be doing this case, and I'm still in the midst of my research, so I'm still learning new things constantly, and I hope you guys are enjoying it, and I hope that I always hate to say enjoying for stuff like this. It's not enjoyable, but it's fascinating. It's super fascinating. I really hope that if you guys are enjoying the podcast or show, that you subscribe. That would be really, really, really appreciated. And I hope people are staying. Everyone in my house is sick. There are 5 of us, and everyone has something different, and it's disgusting. Currently, I have pink eye, so just foul. 2 out of 5 of us have pink eye, so I'm sure it's going to be 5 out of 5 real soon. So I'm trying to keep up, but it's a lot of crap. So that's basically it. And stay safe out there, because you never know who's knocking. This podcast is produced in collaboration with Lost Line Media. Artwork by August Digital. Music by Matthew Cook.